This is We Bleed Orange and Black, the podcast for Halloween and horror lovers. Join us as we interview creators, discuss our favorite folklore, and share original spooky stories. I'm Jeff C. Carter, and I'll be moderating today's panel. Our topic is The New Gothics, Alternate Lenses into Horror. I'm going to go around the horn and have our panelists introduce themselves so that we can all get familiar with the sounds of their voice. I'm going to start with Josh Millican.
First of all, thanks for having me on, Jeff. It's a pleasure to share the arena with all of you who I consider my peers and my colleagues. Very happy and honored to be here. I'm best known as the author of Teleportasm, which is book 3 in the Killer VHS series. This evening, though, I'll be talking from the standpoint of my upcoming novel, Dopefoot, which I've been calling a gory cryptid mystery. But I have since been looking at it through the lens of Gothic, specifically Redwood's Gothic, a new branch which I only recently knew existed, specifically the Gothic elements along the Pacific Northwest.
Hello, I'm Clay Vermulm. I am on this panel, I think, largely because of my recent horror collection, Rain Shadows, which we've sort of branded as Pacific Northwest Gothic. And I can get into what I think that means later in the show. That's a collection of horror stories that all take place here in Washington State, where I reside, co-written with my partner in crime, Tamara K. Selman, who is also a very talented Gothic horror writer. So thank you for having me on the show. I'm stoked to be here and nerd out about horror because that's my favorite thing to do.
Welcome to the show, Clay. Scotty Milder.
Hi, I'm Scotty Milder, and echo everyone else. Thank you, Jeff, for having me on. So I'm a writer and filmmaker based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Published a whole bunch of short stories. Currently shopping a novel. Have a feature film from over a decade ago called Dead Billy, which has got some definite Gothic elements to it. One thing I'm really interested in being a Southwest writer is exploring the idea of how do you set like the Gothic in like the desert or up in the mountains. These iconic Western locations, how do you make them Gothic?
Up next, we have Moshaty.
Hi, I'm Moshaty. Again, thank you, Jeff, to having me on the panel. I'm really excited to be here. I want to also say shout out to Josh Millican, who was very, very kind to do the press for Nick's Horror Collective for Dread Central back in the day. Really appreciate that support. That was wonderful for us. So I am a writer,
this
producer,
is the first time
lecturer.
we're meeting face to face. Sorry.
Yeah, it's lovely. I appreciate it. I'm a writer, producer. I'm a lecturer and horror cinema. I've been lecturing on women's trauma and horror cinema for about a decade. I also lecture in cultural identity and trauma throughout horror as a genre. I write mostly Gothic in my short story collections, first being Love the Sinner, second being Claire Violence, which just came out. Both of those novelette are the big Gothic stories in each one of them. I'm a nonfiction writer as well. I do a ton of nonfiction writing for Rutledge and Palgrave. I'm in Palgrave of the Zombie. Just did Darkest Margins with 1428 Publishing, which is having me on the preliminary ballot for Stoker for nonfiction, which was really cool. So I am always doing that. I run a podcast about women's trauma. I'm the editor-in-chief and founder of Nighttime Magazine, which is all about diverse perspectives in horror with an academic twist. So that is me, and I'm happy to be here with you guys.
Welcome to the show, Mo. And finally, we have our man in Texas, Mr. Johnny Compton.
Well, I was going to thank Jeff for having me on, but he's been thanked enough, and somebody needs to start giving him a hard time.
Thank you.
Among us. This is way more love than I've ever seen anybody, a collective give Jeff.
Yeah, I don't like it.
Setting.
I'm very uncomfortable.
I disagree. I could tell the glow emanating from you. I could see it starting to happen.
Yes, we're bald men, Johnny. They can see that. They see the glow emanating.
You're exactly. Your power is already growing too mighty. No, but in all sincerity, thanks for having me on. My first book, The Spite House, is a Gothic haunted house story. And my latest book coming up is called Dead First. It revisits some Gothic elements that I originally introduced. And for the panel, one of the perspectives I wanted to talk about is just the idea of when Gothic converges with water, horror, and the sea. Dead First introduces some elements of that, or brings in some elements of that. And some of my favorite stories that I've ever read involve haunted places or spooky places in Gothic settings, and the sea is adjacent, and there's some kind of relationship there and convergence that captivates me probably ever since I was a child.
Before we attempt to nail down a definition of the Gothic, I want to go around the panel, sort of round robin, and we can all just toss elements into this gumbo that you associate with Gothic. I want everyone to give me 3. Other people are probably going to steal your answers. So just keep pulling because I'm trying to illustrate just how rich or broad this categorization is. Go ahead, Josh.
I was going to say isolation, decay, and gloom.
I would say oppression reemerging is a big one. Horror kind of leaking under the door, out from the ground. It feels like Gothic horror leaks into the characters' lives from the setting. I don't know how to put that in a succinct way, so I'll say that. And then it feels like forgotten places.
Johnny.
As Joshua mentioned, isolation and decay. Those were the first things that popped to mind. And then just overall pervasive darkness.
I'm going to say the hysterical woman trope is big in Gothic horror. Female suffering. If you're talking about Southern Gothic horror, we're talking about unresolved historical violence and also just weather. Weather is very weird in Gothic, whether it be Southern Gothic where it's quite dry or it's quite misty. You're looking at like Northern New England Gothic horror where that more like mountainous and isolation. So yeah, to what Josh was saying about isolation, but also obsession.
Scotty?
Yeah, so to kind of echo what everyone else has said, I mean, I would say definitely this connection to location and past, the sort of the past bleeding into the present or looming over the present in some ways. Definitely the sense of isolation. And then I think very much like repression, like Clay, kind of like what you were saying with, oppression creeping forward from the location, but also repressed emotions. It could be desire, fear, anger, but it's all kind of at a simmer until it's not.
It's interesting that we've all converged on those few, perhaps clear essences of the Gothic, because in my research, I found a list of like 30 things that are considered Gothic elements. Just to speed read few, imprisonment, murder, sleep-like and death-like states, live burials, doubles, unnatural echoes or silences, obscured family ties, unintelligible writings, remote locations, dreams, demons, demonic possession, architecture, insanity, ancestral sins, and that's just like half the list. With such a giant word cloud swirling around this idea of Gothic, Mo, will you save us? Will you try to put some kind of lid on this cauldron?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's what's sensational about that big word cloud. And like you said, you only threw like half of the list. Is I'm sure like the minute you started thinking, like listing things off, like things just popped into our head. We're like, oh, that story, oh, this, oh, that. For me, when you were talking about like dreamlike state, The Fall of the House of Usher, Edgar Allan Poe, that's a huge Gothic isolation story, right? Set in upstate somewhere, like middle of nowhere, right? The doubles, like we think of Man in the Iron Mask, that's a Gothic story as well. But I think for us, if we're talking about like new Gothics and especially the modernization or trying to bring those elements of the past to our work now, I think a lot of the same issues still arise, right? There's still like sects of the universe that still believe in demonic possession and are doing something about it. If anyone saw Godless, the Enfield Exorcism, that movie made me so mad. It's an Australian exorcism film where a woman, no spoilers, but she passes away because the church is like, well, you win some, you lose some, you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. So for that is really interesting about how we can still kind of carry all of these elements like poisoning and doubling and dreamlike states. I mean, think of where we are with the books that we read that feel like fever dreams. Those are still Gothic elements. And I think that we're so lucky to be living in a time where if you really kind of dug into the bucket and you really kind of moved from left to right of what's in the list and what's a new release, I think you'd be hard pressed not to find something that had a Gothic element to it, because it's so ingrained in our culture that it's hard to kind of separate the two.
That was very well said. Thank you. And one thing I read, it said that modern horror is a branch of Gothic literature. I wonder if it is so hard to see any distinction in what I consider horror or good horror and the Gothic, because we're just living inside an entirely Gothic context. Every story we look at has one of these elements. And just as a way to sort of clarify it for myself, I was trying to think of a story that wasn't Gothic horror. Okay, you're driving to the grocery store and you get attacked by a bear. Probably not Gothic, but also a story I wouldn't particularly want to read or watch or write. It's just kind of limp. There's like nothing emotional or meaty or atmospheric there. There's nothing metaphorical about it.
What if the bear is on cocaine?
See, now you've nailed it. Now you've brought it back around.
Valid question.
Valid. But then you're getting into psychosis and you're getting into some
It's
psychological
madness,
elements, and we're right
exactly.
back in that
There you go.
Gothic framework.
Some demonic possession right there.
Yeah, it's the suppressed sin of the narcotics trade and all the suffering it engenders as characterized by the bear. Johnny, you did it. You saved it.
You did it. Good job, Johnny. Good job.
Okay, sticking with Mr. Compton, as you said, your novel, The Spite House, has Gothic elements. Spite House is set in Texas. You had mentioned that a lot of people call it Southern Gothic. Do you think that's valid? Do you think it's just marketing speak?
I think for the Spite House, it's a little bit more so marketing. I think it's Spite House, probably if you were to line it up with a lot of those elements, a little bit more conventional Gothic as opposed to Southern Gothic, but maybe that's just my own bias. Sometimes I don't even necessarily know whether Texas should be considered, or at least anything west of like Lansdale country should even be considered the South. You know, Lansdale is East Texas. You start getting toward Houston, which is basically West Louisiana. That to me is the South. I'm in San Antonio. You start moving more toward, you know, Scotty's territory and like the Southwest. And that's kind of its own thing that has never really been packaged properly. Probably you could do, I mean, not even probably, I can't think of examples off the top of my head, but you could definitely do Southwest Gothic as its own specific thing because, as Scotty mentioned earlier on, the desert location is kind of different from, it can give you some of those same elements, but it's a different vibe at the same time as Southern Gothic. And the type of decay that you see in the desert, it's going to be present, but what it looks like and feels like and smells like as compared to swampier marshland in the South, the moss hanging on trees that I remember when I grew up in Mississippi versus the drier, more arid type of desolation that you get when you start moving westward. I think that's a distinction. And then the Spite House is set in the hill country of Texas, so it's kind of occupying a between space, which is why I think it lands a little bit more in that burnt offerings kind of space of this could seemingly take place almost anywhere. Mo mentioned Fall of House of Ushers, upstate somewhere. And there's like some of that classically Gothic where it kind of feels like you could both feel the exact atmosphere of that place, and yet you feel like you can also pick it up and transport it somewhere and it would work there as well. And I think that speaks to the variety of the ways that Gothic can affect us because it can be very localized and at the same time be very universal.
Scotty, Johnny was saying Southwest Gothic could be a thing. Do you agree or disagree?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I agree. I mean, I think that, you know, a lot of what characterizes the Southwest, which I think you can kind of like transmute into a Gothic vibe or setting, is you were talking about this sense of isolation, you know, about when you're in the desert and you see nothing for miles around except for like mesas off in the distance. I mean, that you like that sense of the land and the location just kind of pressing down on you is one thing like I try to capture a lot in my fiction. I also think, you know, we talk about claustrophobia so much with the Gothic, and you know, the Southwest, it's almost inverts that because it's more agoraphobia. I've had friends come out and visit from the East Coast and they are freaked out by the sky out here, that the sky like never ends, it goes forever.
Can I just interject as a transplant to New Mexico? One of the things that really disturbed me profoundly is that I'm used to looking up into the night sky and seeing stars or a little bit of light pollution, something. Where I live in Albuquerque, there is a very, very thin cloud layer that forms across the sky at sunset. There's not enough light pollution to illuminate it, but it is just enough cloud layer to completely erase every star out of the sky. So when you walk out, it's just the sky is total blackness. And because the land is so flat, 70 to 80% of your entire perspective is just a bar of black across everything in all directions. And it just sucks in light like Vanta Black. It's freaky. I mean, driving at night is scary. It feels like your headlights don't work because it just sucks up all the light. Sorry, Scotty. You were saying.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's absolutely true. And then if you get out of the city, you and I are both in Albuquerque, so I know exactly what you're talking about. But then you go up into the mountains or go up like where I grew up in Los Alamos, which is like up in the mountains, there's very little light pollution. It's like you don't just see the stars, you see the entire Milky Way, you see the texture of the night, and that's freaky in its own way. And that's where like the Southwest Gothic vibe kind of border into cosmic horror. And I know exactly what you're talking about. Like there's a highway in Colorado called the Gun Barrel. That's the straightest road in Colorado. It goes for like 100 miles or something without a curve, and you can see headlights from 20 miles away, and it freaks you out if you've never been on that before, because there's like you said, there's nothing else around. You don't see any towns, you don't see anything. So if you're driving up the Gun Barrel at night, I mean, you feel like you're in some sort of strange void. It's very weird.
We're all talking about decay. Specifically in the Southwest, I want to talk about radioactive decay. Right. Scotty and I did an event recently, and just off the cuff, he was regaling us with stories about the Demon Core. You know, you're from Los Alamos. There's this sort of haunted nuclear history in New Mexico that is a very present sort of sin of our fathers.
Yeah, I mean, very specifically, like, you know, I'm third generation Los Alamos. My grandfather was there during the Manhattan Project. My mom grew up there. I grew up there. You know, so it's like that's very present in my mindset and in my writing. And that idea, I mean, one thing, you know, I won't go into the history of the Demon Core, but like in Los Alamos, we have a canyon called Acid Canyon. And it's where they used to like bury weird, creepy shit that you don't want to pick up. That's kind of everywhere. And I think when talking about the nuclear aspect of things, the radioactive decay, I mean, there's the idea of like, we don't know what's out in the desert. It's almost like an entity that can kill you, because it's not a bomb, it's not an explosion, it's what's left over, but it's still lingering and it can still poison you, essentially.
That's Gothic as fuck.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, from the Southwest to the Pacific Northwest, this is going to be a two-hander with Josh and Clay. When I think of Josh's new book, I'm thinking more deep forest. Clay, you guys have explored so much of the Pacific Northwest. That's sort of your mission statement. I think of like mountains and isolation and rotting timber towns and things like that. So what is Pacific Northwest about the Gothic, or vice versa?
Yeah, you want to go first, Josh?
No, please take it away, Clay.
Okay. I'm going to pull up my notes then.
Oh, God. Oh, no. We're going to be here all day.
They're light notes. This is really just because my memory is absolute shite. So I have to remind myself what I want to say. So for me, the Gothic, just in general, and almost all my favorite horror stories are Gothic horror stories in some regard. It's about living in a gilded cage. A lot of classic Gothic stuff to me. That's why so many of them take place in these old mansions and these old houses and these places that were supposed to be, even the like historical context of Gothic, you know, if you go back to like Gothic architecture and where that idea comes from, I feel like the whole premise of it is these things were built to be monuments of power. They were built to be monuments of like who we're supposed to look up to societally. And the horror emerges when we actually look at what those monuments were built upon, which is the suffering of everybody beneath them, the suffering of everybody who worked within them. Oftentimes the suffering of everybody who fucking lived inside of them. Like Mo, you were talking specifically about the women, but there is a reason most of the best horror Gothic writers are women, because like they understand that shit to a level that like so few people do. And I could list them off. I'm sure we'll have a segment where we share some of our favorites, but I have a big long list here. For the Pacific Northwest, it's interesting because as like post-colonial oppression goes, the PNW is it's like one of the last places that was settled, colonized, I should say. It was one of the last places to be affected by that movement. I feel like all those wounds are super fresh out here. It has all the same elements that that the Southwest Gothic does too. Like it's got a lot of that like new capitalist wound of we have nuclear fallout too. Eastern Washington is a huge nuclear testing wasteland. They call it downwinders if you live in the Tri-Cities, because you're downwind from the nuclear testing facility, and they've had all kinds of trouble with their water and stuff like that. Tamara has a story in Rain Shadows set in the Tri-Cities for that reason. The isolation is out here, and you have that decay very actively happening right in front of your eyes. I mean, a lot of our ghost stories out here are not that old. You know, many of us were alive when Starvation Heights happened, or when the Cedro Woolley Insane Asylum was open. Like that's not that long ago. And that's just not even to mention any of the suffering of the indigenous people, but everything out here is built on that. There's still abandoned mining towns like Monte Cristo. If you ever come out here and you want to go to a cool ghost town, it's a little bit of a hike, but you can get to an old logging town called Monte Cristo. And they don't even have good records of how many people died out there, but like a lot of people, because it was a perfect example of them trying to squeeze everything they could out of the land and going way too deep into the woods and trying to build a town there just because they thought they could conquer anything with industry. And they learned pretty quick that nature is a lot more powerful than the railroad or your like 18th century mining equipment. So they had to abandon it after lots of people died from natural causes. I think Pacific Northwest has all the best parts of like that New England Gothic stuff, but it doesn't necessarily have the same level of like colonial antiquity. So you're working more with like postmodern concepts like mining towns and Seattle. I mean, Seattle's literally built on 2 burnt down versions of itself. And there's the whole underground tour where you can explore Seattle as an old smuggler's den like it used to be. I mean, that's what it was here for. It was here for like smugglers and people headed to Alaska to continue to exploit the land up there. But this is what I think is Gothic about the PNW. I think it's got that isolation. It's got the creepy, misty woods. It's got these towering, imposing natural landscapes, whether you're on the west side with the mountains and the jungles or the east side with the desert. But you kind of got it all, so you can really explore it.
Josh, Clay had mentioned going too deep into the woods. Do you want to speak to that?
I mean, I want to speak to so much of it. I'm really glad you went first, Clay, because you really gave like the crash course. And like I said in the beginning, I'm going to kind of come at this from an even more specific angle, which is the Redwoods Gothic. Everything Clay said about Pacific Northwest Gothic is inherent in a lot of ways to Redwoods Gothic. When you talk about Pacific Northwest Gothic, you can be talking about everything from Northern California to Alaska. It's really vast. And when you get to Redwoods Gothic, you're really kind of zeroing in on some of these specific themes. You know, redwoods in nature, I don't know how well people know this, they only grow in Northern California and Oregon on the coast. That's the only place in the world where redwood trees grow naturally. So when you say Redwoods Gothic, you're getting to a really more of a specific locale. You know, so you look at the things that are specific to that geography. I'm going to backtrack just a little bit and explain how I started thinking about Redwoods Gothic. I have a book, Goatfoot, is coming out in June, and I heard about Allison Mick's book, Humboldt Cut. And I was like, oh, wow, we're both authors who have this Northern California themed book coming out. We should connect and maybe do some panels together. So I read Humboldt Cut and I met Allison, and you know, we're hoping to do a string of dates together this summer. And Allison asked me if I'd ever met Bitter Corella, and I had heard of Bitter, and it turns out Bitter is really close to me, so we were able to connect. Bitter is the author of Moonflow, which came out in October, which happens to take place in the Pacific Northwest, but even more specifically, the Redwoods Gothic area. So now we get really specific. Our books come at it from very different perspectives, but what's similar? We talk about the past coming into the future. All 3 of our books mention or have something to do with, there are ghosts of the logging industry, the gold rush, and drugs, the cannabis industry. In the case of Moonflow, it's mushrooms. Now it's much more prominent in my book and in Bitter's book than in Allison's book, but that's where you start to see the overlap, and it has so much to do with the geography of that. Sorry, man, I think in bullet points this is how I go. But like Clay mentioned, the fact that it's one of the last places that was colonized. It's actually one of the first places that humans settled in North America. The earliest remains of human settlements are in the Pacific Northwest. You just think about that and the fact that human history is almost synonymous with violence. You know, don't romanticize the past. It's always been tough. So, you know, you think about the fact that there could be 10,000 years of human conflict in the Pacific Northwest, and all of a sudden you're talking about a lot of ghosts in a very spooky environment in this area of trees that tower over you, where you're always discombobulated. I think the Misty Moors got nothing on the Pacific Northwest and the fog that clings to the trees up there. So like a lot of us have hit on, it's almost like everything's Gothic, but it's more of like, when you diagnose someone with an illness, you have a checklist of 10 things. And if they have like 4 or 5 of those things, they probably have the illness. So in this case, we're talking about the Gothic illness.
The illness of Gothic.
Everything. But it's easier to say what isn't Gothic. And I think crowds are not Gothic. There's something about being cut off that is important about Gothic, which is why I don't think a lot of noir is actually Gothic, but that's another tangent to take it even further down. But
so one more point I want to hit with Josh and Clay about Pacific Northwest. We have this lovely laundry list or list of symptoms to diagnose what is and is not Gothic. For me, architecture is a huge component of it, be it in a ruined castle, a decaying mansion, or in a cityscape, which we could get into. But I think it's interesting that in the Pacific Northwest, at least in the Redwood Gothic, you are surrounded by these imperious giants that just dominate the landscape. And they seem a little more to me, maybe closer to cosmic horror, because they are utterly unconcerned with humankind. They'll outlive us all, but it is sort of claustrophobic. I mean, they own the sky, and you walk beneath them at your peril.
One of the things that connects all these 3 books that I mentioned too was the fact that the forest itself is kind of personified in that Lovecraftian way. It is a much more ancient intelligence that has been there for a lot longer. So, that's definitely the Lovecraftian element. Now, is the beast angry at being awoken by the gold rush, by the violence, by the logging? Or is the beast so massive that it just doesn't even care, that it's completely cruelly indifferent? And either way is really scary.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in on the architecture piece because what you're talking about, the Redwoods, spoke to me there, Josh. I think they represent the archaeology of the natural world, which is what people are inherently trying to be better than when they build massive cathedrals. But when you walk in the Redwood forest, you realize like, hey, this has been around a lot longer than us, and it will be here long after we are gone. And if you try to spend one night in the forest without anything to take care of yourself, you will realize exactly how ill-equipped you are to exist amongst the cosmos, or even the fucking earth, just that we live on, and that is actually perfectly suited for us to survive. So I think there's a true terror, and it goes the same for the Southwest Gothic. That's the same thing. That's the architecture of the land. That's the darkness of the sky and the vastness of the plains. And you just can't like truly comprehend the terror there. And the more you know about it, the more terrifying it is, which I think like that's why indigenous folklore is so closely guarded. It's why it's so it's a well-kept secret amongst each individual tribe. And there's a reason typically indigenous folklore is more like, hey, you don't fuck with that stuff, like not ghost hunting. It's more like, hey, yeah, they're out there, leave them alone. Like they won't fuck with you if you don't fuck with them. And I think the forest and the desert and all that kind of really personifies that natural landscape. So I think you still have that antiquity bleeding in. And then one more thing I thought about while you're saying that. I think that is a difference with PNW or Southwest Gothic as opposed to classical like English Gothic or whatever. I think there's a lot of the land actively resisting and like the characters being an active part of the colonization and the land pushing back against them is a very common thing in more like Neo-Gothic context. Whereas like Haunting of Hill House, it feels like that house has been there for 10,000 years, right? And so you go in there and it feels like the Redwoods, but I think they kind of cultivate the same thing. The difference is you're actively trying to conquer when you're mining or when you're colonizing, right? And the Hill House, same thing. What are they doing? They're going in, they're renovating, they're changing it, they're trying to resell it for a profit. So it's kind of the same thing as a logging town getting destroyed by something cosmic and supernatural or whatever in a lot of ways.
Scotty, you had a note?
Oh, I was just gonna quick interjection. My brother lives in Oregon, so I've been up there. And I was talking about my East Coast friends coming to the Southwest and being freaked out. The first time I went and visited him in Oregon, there was something about what you guys are saying about those trees, the architecture of the land, the coming from a place that's everything is brown to a place that is just almost like brilliant green. It almost felt phantasmagorical to me. It almost felt like a fantasy landscape, and I found it very intimidating. Just from an outsider's perspective, it almost overwhelming in that sense.
Mo, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you grew up on New England Gothic, and then you moved to England.
I grew up in upstate New York, so I grew up in like wine country area. I grew up in Harriet Tubman's hometown, which is like really fantastical for me, but also just having access to a lot of the spiritualism started in my area. Mary Todd Lincoln used to come to my hometown and do seances with William Seward and his wife. It's just, built around that whole spiritualism era. But also, if you're talking about like New England Gothic or Northern Gothic, New York Gothic, we're troubled. It's a really troubled area. I mean, you've got obviously a witch trial area, you've got puritanical things happening, you've got a lot of colonization happening in that area, but also even just kind of moving through the time of that is, you have a lot of religious horror happening. We have the Great Migration of people coming up and getting out of the South in the 30s, Black and brown folk moving up towards the North, which was supposed to be a safe area, which was still really riddled with racism. There's a lot of Southern flags flying in our tiny little towns in between our Northern New York cities. There's a lot of that. So it wasn't a safe area for that either, but kind of growing up on those stories of, isolation, coldness, grotesque families. The legacy of slavery is still very, very much happening in the North. Frontier towns, religious surveillance, gender surveillance, that stuff is still happening very much in the North, especially if we're talking about where women were concerned. And then also where the 14th Amendment was, there was still a big power struggle of that.
Johnny, going from the South to Texas, we've talked a lot about the Southwest and the features of the landscape. How would you slide a blade between what is uniquely Gothic about the Texas setting versus Southern Gothic or Southwest Gothic?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, this is going to sound anti-Texan of me, and I have reasons to feel that way, I guess, in modern times. But we have a tendency to think in Texas of ourselves as being apart from things and different. It's the Lone Star State and so grandly unique. And if there's anything that does set it apart, it's just the fact that it's easy to accumulate a lot of different things in Texas because it's so vast. It's a state that probably should be 4 different states. And so it has swamp country, it has hill country, it has the northern part of the state that actually gets colder than people realize. And then you start getting toward the west, toward El Paso and Laredo, and you start basically venturing into legitimately desert terrain. And that is the true part of the Southwest. And I'm kind of smack dab, almost in the middle, somewhat centralized here in San Antonio, where it's, not the same as everything else. And yet, Texas does have certain things that are specific to it and unique to it. And I feel like those things are probably pretty unpleasant. Texas is the state that has the worst natural disaster in United States history. And I love that Mo mentioned earlier the weather playing a factor in the Gothic, because that's one of the things I think about is like, the dark and stormy night, right? And weather in Texas can be as chaotic as it can be in a lot of other places, but especially the idea has always struck me. The island of Galveston was once basically just underwater for a day when the storm came, the 1900 storm. Joshua mentioned crowds can't be Gothic. And, there's obviously the truth to that is the isolation is the Gothic element. There is this strange kind of clash that happens sometimes, though, where sometimes you introduce the idea of isolation within the multitude. I mean, one of the scariest books I've ever read is a nonfiction book. It was Isaac Storm by Eric Larson about the Galveston hurricane. And it's this sense that once the hurricane comes in, you are now trapped in your house. There are thousands, tens of thousands of people on this island, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 people die, right? But you're living this Gothic nightmare to a certain extent in this house where you're trapped inside. Everybody else could be experiencing it, but it doesn't matter. You feel like you are alone in this situation, in this environment. And the sea is kind of reclaiming, not even kind of, it is for the moment reclaiming this land from the arrogance Clay and Joshua and everybody's really spoken to, this idea of the arrogance and imposition on nature. And all of a sudden, what happens if that gets turned around on you in this Gothic sense? And this is a real life version of that, trying to conquer this land that probably should never have been, at least not built upon to the extent that it was at the time. And people thought it was going to be the crown jewel of the Gulf Coast. All of a sudden it gets obliterated. And there are actual ghost town versions of that nearby that should have been the warning sign that Galveston could get hit like this. There's a town called Indianola that's about as Gothic as you can imagine, in terms of, to Scotty's point, that kind of open space version of it, where it's like, oh, I can look around and all I can see is this. Well, all you can see there is pretty much water, because there used to be a town here and now there's a historical marker and there's nothing else anymore because they got slammed by back-to-back hurricanes and people just abandoned the town. And what's, scarier than a ghost town, and a true ghost town in that sense, where the weather came in and just wiped out humankind and wiped out civilization. So I think being home to those kinds of things, while at the same time having this sense that, a lot of people in Texas want to have of the independent spirit, and we pioneered certain things and we went out and we braved this and that. And what you really did maybe is kind of speaking to some of the points that were made earlier from Josh and Clay. What if we awakened something, or what if that something is just indifferent to us? There's nothing more indifferent and yet feeling personal than like weather obliterating you. There's another, I could go on about this. I got to pump the brakes on myself, but there's like an infamous hurricane that happened the day that I graduated high school. I'll never forget the Gerald, Texas tornado, or I said hurricane, my mistake, tornado. The Gerald, Texas tornado north of San Antonio, near Austin, somewhere between. And it had what they called the dead man walking. If you look into a tornado and it almost looks like it's walking, it's taking steps. And this tornado, unfortunately, just completely wipes out this small neighborhood that is mostly made of prefab homes, manufactured trailer homes. And partly because it is one of the slowest moving, ironically, it's called the dead man walking, and it's one of the slowest moving tornadoes to have devastated, a certain part of the population on record. It almost arcs over the town. It's moving at 1 mile an hour at one point, kills, just maims, horribly destroys people's lives. And we have that unique kind of component to it too. And I feel like those are the things I try to draw on when I think of what's happened here in Texas and these kind of tragedies. And again, that sense of I'm part of a multitude, a community, but what's more isolating than feeling like a tornado is parked on my house and is moving at 1 mile an hour until my house is no more. And the damage is so unique that when other people say, oh, a tornado came through, and they're often liken it to like a bomb went off. When people came through Gerald, they were like, it's not even like a bomb went off. It's like the place got vaporized. There's just nothing. We eventually find remains, but we got to go find these remains. They're not just strewn about. For a second, it's like, what the hell even happened here? And so those kind of things, I think you can imbue that if you want to. And it's dark stuff to look into because it's the real stuff. But so much of our fiction is inspired by the real things, as you guys have already laid out so many examples of. And so these are the things that I think can imbue Texas with something unique that a lot of Texans, I think, are either unaware of or don't want to kind of think about.
Going from the ultra wide screen oppression of a tornado landing on your house, I wanted to take a look inside the Gothic at the heroines or the people trapped inside these structures of oppression. Before we started recording, you were talking about the importance of women in the Gothic.
Oh, hell yeah. Yeah.
By all means, please take it away.
Take it away. Yeah, we have a lot to thank for that. I mean, if we're looking at, just kind of women as a whole, in Gothic stories, they've been the center of most of them. And like my favorite ones are The Mysteries of Udolpho. I love that very much. Anne Radcliffe, Jane Eyre, Rebecca. If we're looking at Daphne du Maurier, gave us the term gaslight. Right. So, I mean, that's what we use to talk about that in therapy. And as someone who's a behavioral therapist, we talk about gaslighting all the time. But I think that it begins with, Gothic horror, especially you have these heroines who are trapped in things. It always starts with a woman who's saying something is wrong. And then everyone being like, not? And she's kind of got to contend with that. She's got to contend with, that's why I said, we were looking at like that was the birth of the hysterical woman trope, the Gothic horror. And if you think about like Gothic horror, like hysteria isn't her condition. It's a strategy for everyone else to build around. So if you really look at that, it's really just kind of, this woman is very centralized to this genre of madness. Women are not to be believed, and it's wicked wiles, and she's just got some things going on, and she doesn't have her shit together, and nobody believe her. Meanwhile, all of these really strange things are happening. You have this woman who, Rebecca, who is just really trying to, understand what the hell's happening. This thing's wrong. This feels wrong. Oh, you're just sort of imagining this. Oh, maybe you need to lie down. Maybe you need to just like have some laudanum and sit your ass down or something. Like nobody really wants to help her out with things. But if we're talking about women in horror and that construct of being isolated or sort of trapped within the structure, if you flip it and you look about Black women in Gothic horror and how different they can be, where you have the white heroine gets to be fragile and unstable, but the Black heroine has to be like silent or monstrous or strong, or she doesn't get to fall apart. She just kind of has to take what life is throwing at them. And that's, kind of having to contend with like slavery, reproductive violence, inherited trauma, gendered violence, psychological destruction. The Black heroine gets to deal with all of that. She doesn't get to have the outburst like the white heroine gets to have. She doesn't get to have a fainting chair and get the laudanum and get the chair to sit down. She doesn't get to do that. So if we're talking about, women as these central characters in horror, and to Clay's point, women writing from a perspective of known psychological, emotional, physical violence, writing from that space, and saying, these are the things that happen to us. These are the spaces that we live within. This is real life shit that's happening to us, this disparity and this inequity and these, all of these inequalities as to whether or not I can do this and say this and be here and want this for myself. Those are all real anxieties that I'm now putting into text. And now I have to frame this story about a woman who has all these things. She's correct. And at the end of the story, even if it's fiction, nobody's going to believe her anyway. And I think that's really horrifying. It's horrifying that really is the crux of the horror for me. If I'm talking about, women in Gothic horror as a whole, there's so much this woman has to do to convince people that she has her wits about her and that she's sane and then she's noticing things. And that kind of moves into all of our modern books and our modern films. When you take something like, obviously you're going to be like Rosemary's Baby. Obviously everyone thought Rosemary was crazy, but she was impregnated by this cult for the greater good. And that was the thing. But if you even take it so far as looking at something like Aliens, where Ripley was right, Ripley tried to tell everybody and she got the proverbial head pat, and nobody believed her until everybody got done and dusted, and then everybody was gone, and it was literally just her and Newt, and it was just like, we lived through this over and over again, and we do feel those experiences of, domestic labor, and that's really hard. Emotional labor, that's really hard. Being confined to a house, being confined to a marriage, and having society tell you that no matter what happens, we're going to side with your husband because you don't know what you're doing. You've got the crazies, lady. And if you think about where we start with those novels, is women really saying, you're going to see one day that we were right. Like all the things that all the stories that we're giving you, this is what we're going through. They're not just fun fiction. We were right. And it took so long for modern medicine to catch up to the fact that maybe women aren't lying when they say this is happening, or maybe this isn't psychosis, because it was literally a medical condition until 1980, where you could institutionalize your partner until 1980 with hysteria. So if we're sitting here thinking about Gothic and we're talking about, the stages of irrational responses from women, or disbelief, or, I have to ask of the stories help women's point of view, which I think they do in some instances, but do those stories also teach people to doubt women's fear even when it's real? Does it do both? Because I feel like it does. Like there are stories that do, and then there are stories that don't. But yeah, I feel like I can talk about this all day. Especially my biggest thing is I also talk in bullet points, Josh. So good on you there. It's my ADHD. Enjoy. But I think that if we take an example that I think you can probably understand where I'm coming from with, understanding women and believing women, or teaching audiences to doubt women's fear. I want you to look at the film Candyman and how Helen gets to be super, super obsessed about Candyman. Helen's a white lady that just pops into Cabrini Green like, heard some stories, guys. I'm really interested. And all of the Black people are being like, please go away. And the Black women are just like, we don't mess with this story. This is not your territory. Please stop being interested. And they're trying to tell her, this is what's happening to us. And Anne Marie, whose baby gets taken by Candyman, and Helen gets blamed for it because she got too deep into something that was absolutely none of her business, is trying to tell her that these things are happening. So again, you have Helen, who gets to be psychologically differently wired and obsessed. And then you have the Black women characters who are just like, this is the truth. Please understand. And then they're still at the end of the stick where they experience harm. But the main story is Helen. I think Candyman is definitely a Gothic story. It's definitely a modern Gothic story. You have like this entity that's here. You have this modern cityscape. You have this ghost story. You have this haunting. You have this psychosis happening. You have possession happening. And then you've got something like the supernatural element, where at the end, where her husband is like, Helen, 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 and then boom, But I want to think about that story, because I think when we think about women in Gothic, we're looking, especially white characters and Black and brown characters, we have to be able to look at both sides of the coin there, and what those characters are allowed to say and what the other characters are not allowed to be. And I'm hoping that we can make those changes. And I've seen those changes in recent stories, and I love that. But I think that we're in a weird spot right now where there is not enough space for Black and brown women, I should say, in Gothic horror to be kind of hysterical, and that's the story. Like, no one's believing me, nobody's listening to me. And that happens to the Black and brown women all the time. Nobody's listening. And then everybody's like, where are the Black and brown ladies? Why are they rescuing us? And it's just, because we don't want to. We're tired. But I think that hopefully we can make changes in that. I don't want that erasure happening with brown characters in modern Gothic horror. But hopefully it's not, those stories won't just be about systems of repression and violence and things like that. And hopefully we can build off of new elements in Gothic, whether it's whether it's a Black heroine in PNW horror. Like, it's, hopefully we can get there. But I do want us to be very aware that there's different Gothic heroines for different stories. Like, we don't all get to experience our Gothic piece equally. But at the end of the day, neither of us are believed off the bat. So that for me is a big thing for women in Gothic horror.
Two threads from that I want to tie up. One is that when you bring in Candyman 2, Farewell to the Flesh, it absolutely cements it as a Gothic story when you get Candyman's origin story, and it becomes very much a Southern Gothic. But you were right. Between the haunting and the ghost story and the decay and the entrapment of Cabrini Green, Candyman is incredibly Gothic. And then with Ripley and Alien, a lot of people have commented that Alien is basically just a haunted house in space. You're trapped with a monster in space. But what I think is really interesting about the Alien context is that the xenomorphs look like the ship, and the ship itself, the architecture, which is trapping people. And the ship itself is a mining ship, just like in the Pacific Northwest. They're going out there to extract and take, and then be humbled and awed by the things they find there that are so much bigger and so beyond human comprehension. The architecture often mirrors what is happening to the characters, and that literally happens in the event of Alien. Scotty, I want to hear your dulcet pipes.
Well, I mean, I agree, obviously, about everything that was said, particularly Candyman being a Gothic story. But one thing that I'm now thinking with Alien and Ripley, I teach a history of horror in film class, and I've talked about Ripley as being a kind of sci-fi take on the final girl trope. I've never really considered the idea that she's a Gothic heroine until now. And now this is kind of opening up this question for me, because I don't think of the slasher film as being Gothic particularly. But now that I'm thinking about it, this whole idea of the final girl seems like a version of what you were saying about the hysterical woman, because often the final girl isn't believed until the end, and I never really considered that connection before.
Yeah, I think what's so interesting about looking at Ripley as a Gothic character is because not only is she, having to, well, number one, she's lied to in the film. She's lied to in the first film. There was not supposed to be an android X, Y, and Z. It's not going to, her company's not telling her the truth. And how many times have we worked for a company where you're just like, we're doing that? Why? None of your business. Like, it's just, we can all kind of relate to that. But I like looking at her as a Gothic character because she's repeatedly sort of sidelined. And even when you get to something like Alien 3, like everyone knows what she's been through, but people are just like, but what if we do this? She's like, oh, okay, maybe not. It is like a haunted house in space. You have so much that she's carrying. And if you watch her arc as a Gothic character, if you take Alien, she is very much sort of thrust into the role of final girl. Like she's the last one left. She's the one that didn't get her head bit off. She's the one that, left with her whole chest intact and a cat. And it's interesting to watch that. And then you get into Aliens where she is now, understands that she again has to fight to be heard, but now she has to deal with not only patriarchal opinion, she has to step into the mother role because nobody else is doing it. She has to kind of rely on somebody else believing her. So she has one constant. And then again, she has to deal with the fact that she's been lied to again about having an android on board. But now this android is the good kind and he's fine. So I think for her, it's like just kind of watching this Gothic character move through, like they pick her up and drop her into a different environment, but she's still the same Gothic piece, which I think is really, really interesting. And I'm so glad that you're thinking about it in a different way now. I mean,
that definitely
fun to me.
Well, because now I'm thinking, you mentioned Alien 3. I think so much of the Gothic, one thing we haven't talked about is this sort of idea of wrestling with grief and sorrow. And by the time we get Ripley in Alien 3, she's lost everything. She lost Newt, 100%. And so, you see this transition of her throughout, particularly those first three films, into like three kind of different aspects of a Gothic heroine. That I think that's really fascinating. That's a really fascinating way to look at not just the overall superstructure of that story and the mythology, but this specific character. I think
and it's something
really great.
that I wanted to touch on with. Am I allowed to ask other people questions? Because that's what I'm going to do.
Please.
I wanted to ask Johnny especially about grief in Gothic horror, grief and loss. If we're talking about that, especially coming from where you're coming from and where you live, about that destruction and loss, not just a physical loss, but also emotional loss, personal loss. Because I just remember talking to a couple folks. I was actually on location at a business. My territory included Plano. I was in the DFW area. I was doing Katy and Waco. That was like part of my things that I needed to do. And I was in Austin to meet up with somebody. And I got everybody's phone lit up in the hotel. And they were like, Harvey is coming, make your plane plans. And that was really, really terrifying because I almost did not get out in time. But to talk to my friends that live in Katy, hearing that destruction and that aftermath, they lost the whole back part of their house, and they lost one of their parents who had a heart attack because they couldn't get out. They were just, they couldn't get out of the home. So I wanted to ask you about, looking at that in something like that grief and that loss in the stories that you write, is it a piece for you to kind of make sense of it and sort of rectify it and write the ending where you do get to have that catharsis through your grief?
Yeah. I mean, I'm inspired by that. I appreciate the question. I'm inspired by it for sure. Like when you mentioned grief in Gothic fiction, when Jeff even approached me about this, the first thing I thought of was one of my favorite stories is The Woman in Black, the novel, and then the 1989. If you haven't seen, I mean, I know Daniel Radcliffe had a adaptation, but if you haven't seen the 1989 BBC adaptation, that is killer, so good, and it's set in this house that is cut off by the waters, and the tide rolls in, etc., and then the haunting that permeates this place is built entirely around grief and entirely around the misery of loss. And there is no real catharsis per se. It's just passed on virally almost. It's almost like a precursor to The Ring or something, where or The Grudge. You've entered this house, you're in the vicinity of this grief that has no outlet, and it will now be passed on generationally, seemingly without end and without any capacity for it to be resolved. And in The Spite House, in my writing in The Spite House, I tackle an element of dealing with grief. In the newest book, Dead First, I tackle an element of that. And again, I mean, my editor even asked me whether or not maybe I need to seek some therapy. You know, she said it in a kinder way, but basically she brought it down to that, because my version of dealing with it is maybe not the healthiest, and it might be reflected on that in the book. And even in some of the short stories I've written, that comes into play, because, you know, Scotty mentioned, you know, we hadn't had a chance to delve into that, but there's so much regret and loss and grief. And it ties into even what Clay and Joshua, you know, Joshua especially mentioned, 10,000 years of conflict and unresolved misery and violence in civilization that's been around here for this long. And what if there's no outlet for it? I mean, there's more injustice than is calculable to the human mind, basically, than we can even imagine, that has existed and has always been there. And that is part of, unfortunately, the Gothic tradition, because it's unfortunately part of the human condition and the human tradition. And I think you guys will be able to speak to that, you know, the PNW having that, because you have such deep, long history as well with these regrettable things and grief, and Clay mentioning that Seattle itself is on top of two different versions of its previous self. And there's a lot of unresolved angst and anguish. And there's, you know, maybe a reason why that's where grunge was born and all of these other kind of things. And so that I'm curious 100%. To see now. I love that we're passing the baton amongst each other now. And we've completely bypassed Jeff, which makes me even happier. No, I'm kidding. I love you, Jeff.
But, yeah, Jeff has left the chat.
I chased him away. I'm sorry. No, like I'm curious for like Clay and Josh, like your perspectives on that.
The title of this panel is The New Gothics, and there are ways that the Pacific Northwest kind of fits the old and the new traditions, because you know, like we've already talked about logging and mining, and then we, you know, talk about how like that's just, you know, in our last century, that it goes back thousands of years, like you said. What makes it a neo-Gothic, I think, is you know, the elements that I'm exploring, that Allison Mick and Bitter Carrera are exploring. We've got this drug trade element kind of like lingering in the background, and that's where you can start to see like new things that are only known in this new age, kind of being seen and brought into literature under this like Gothic model. So I think that's something that makes it both old and new. And just to kind of seem smart as I segue out, one of the things that I love about Gothic that we've all kind of hit on is the supernatural element. And, you know, people face the supernatural. First of all, I love the fact that the supernatural isn't necessary. It can be the answer, like in Wuthering Heights, but it can also be where you pull the Scooby-Doo mask off, like in Jane Eyre. So it can go either way. But I think what all Gothic does is it forces you to face the supernatural. And what do you do in that moment? You go crazy or you keep your composure. So that's something that I think is very distinctly Gothic. You don't get off the hook without peeking on the other side of the veil.
Beautifully said, sir. Beautifully said.
Very well said. Since sanity and the Gothic form or mode, aesthetic or genre, whatever you want to call it, is often a reaction to periods of enlightenment or progress or science gaining ground, there's often this reaction of Gothic artists saying, but look into your dreams and imagination and remember what's still out there. Think about what we don't know.
Just to piggyback on this idea of the supernatural, and I mean, this is a thing in my feature film, Dead Billy, like I was really trying to wrestle with is this attitude or this idea of where does the supernatural and insanity kind of blend together? Like, can your own mind be haunted by your past? Because that movie is specifically about someone dealing with the aftermath of an abusive relationship. But I tried to approach it in this way where we don't know exactly what is going on in their head versus what might be a ghost story surrounding it. And I think that is one thing that sort of differentiates the Gothic approach to supernatural versus like a more traditional horror story, is that there's always a psychological bent to it. There's always this porous border between what is going on in the character's head versus what is an external. I mean, this is The Haunting of Hill House, right? This is Nell's kind of journey in that, is like what is within her versus what is within the house itself.
Mm-hmm. I like to attach myself very firmly to metaphors. So I'm going to do that right now. I'm going back to my gilded cage metaphor because I think a lot of what Mo spoke to especially is really powerful regarding that idea. To me, so much of Gothic horror and especially the supernatural elements within it, the supernatural to me is the reality that we are trying to put within the cage and make look pretty. The reality of human nature, the reality of industrial expansion, the reality of building a fucking palace over land that was doing much better before you built a palace there, and like imported grass from some other country and like destabilize the entire ecosystem so that you could have like a golf course in your backyard. I could go on, but I think that's all part of the gilded cage. And Gothic resonates with so many people because it's so institutionalized within our society. I mean, Mo, your example of hysteria is a perfect illustration of this. Like patriarchal oppression has been so efficient and all-encompassing that in so many ways, women have been imprisoned within their own bodies by like beauty standards and by expectations. And it's like, hey, be happy, smile, but don't smile so loudly. You know, do you have to smile so loudly? But yeah, it's totally that, like that idea. These women in these stories are locked within not only their palatial mansion, but also in their own body. And it's all predicated on a lie that this is better. And I think the supernatural represents the negative effects of that lie. So that's just another way. I think it's like, it's a pretty cage and the supernatural is what like needs to escape for the truth of that cage to be realized by the audience. PNW Gothic specifically, the promise is the same. The lie is the same, you know, like nobody came out west because they thought like it's going to suck harder than where I was now. You know, everybody came out west because they were like, oh, I guess I can own land. And the idea of owning land is so institutionalized in like Eurocentric society. Like you look at people who own a big house and the people who came out west, they wanted to be like that person, you know, or they wanted to escape something else that was worth. They wanted to escape the industry, whatever. But like when you come out west and you build a homestead, like a really good isolation, like Western Gothic I saw recently is that movie, The Wind. I don't know if anyone saw The Wind. But Johnny saw it. I quite liked it. It's a female written, female directed kind of indie film. Really, really good. If you haven't seen it, it's free on Shudder. You should check it out. But that was a great example of it's the same lie. It's the same lie as living in a mansion. And I think what's so sinister about that gilded cage is not even the lie itself. It's the fact that you're supposed to be thankful for the fucking lie. You're supposed to be like glad you live in the prison. You're supposed to fucking like, oh, thank you so much. I get to live in this rich house. So what a great life I must have. Or, oh, I get my own house out on the prairie. I own it. It's just me and my husband out here. Life's going to be great. It's like, maybe it fucking won't. And like when you start to tell people that it isn't and nobody listens to you, that's a terrifying reality that you have to live within there. So I think there's a lot to it, but
Yeah. It's like, what could possibly go wrong all the way out here, isolated with
Yeah.
just my husband?
with just one
Nothing.
hubby, it's going
My
great.
husband and
And
1,000
no one
wolves.
can hear me scream.
Yep.
So
Exactly.
this is about the new Gothic because I was really interested in exploring modes and forms of fiction beyond the Southern Gothic. But in doing my reading, I found out that the Southern Gothic is actually a reaction to this idea that the South is a genteel place. We did nothing wrong. The Confederacy was actually a righteous cause. And so writers began to dredge up all of the history, all of the guilt and shame and sin, and thrust it into our faces and say, no, this is what actually happened, what you're trying to bury. And since then, I don't think you can really be an American without grappling with the Southern Gothic. When I initially conceived of this panel, I was kind of thinking about an interesting trend that's going on in fiction, which is decentering. So Ray Wild, friend of the show, is exploring the idea of decentering men and her stories. These are just stories about women and just tell our own stories. And I know that there's African-American fiction that's being done to just decenter white people. Do you think there is space for the Gothic there when you get away from the repression, the oppression, the shame, the sin, the baggage? This isn't all play, but obviously, Mo, Johnny, I would love your input on this.
I mean, I think, well, first of all, Mo is more intelligent than I am, so I'm going to defer to her.
We're all deferring to Mo on this.
It's just the glasses.
Well, I mean, I think objectively, you're probably much more educated than I am. But also, I know for me, I do think that there is space for this very clearly. It's a weird thing, though, where I think I've done this a couple of times, but I think I've also done it unconsciously. Like the characters, the stories I've written do decentralize, white people, but not like I'm deliberately setting out to say I'm going to tell a story and there's no white people invited. Because I like white people for the most part. Well, for a certain part, at least. I like the ones here. I can say that for sure. So that's got to count for something. But I try to, like, my version of the kind of statement that I want to make on it is that I want to get us to a point where we don't have to make a statement. And I know that we're not there yet, but I think that that's my end goal. Is kind of like Mo said, I want to be able to write the story where it's a Black woman being the, my friend Agatha Andrews is really steeped in this down here in Texas. And she talks about the women running away from houses in the dark, like the posters for the Gothic, or the book covers rather for the Gothic used to be. I'd love to be able to feature a Black woman on that, the same way that Isabel de Canes, I believe, with the Vampires of El Norte, that cover is that echoing that, but for Latina woman, right? And then Mexican Gothic does something very similar. I want to be able to do that and like let the Black woman be hysterical, and also get us to a stage where I don't have to point out that that's what I was doing. I just wanted to write that story, and that's it. I've been very fortunate. It's a state of privilege for me right now that I'm able to do that I've done it with the books that I've written so far. And it doesn't have to be brought up as like, were you deliberately doing this? It's just like, no, this is just, I decided to choose these characters. And one of my friends, Philip Fracassi, his book that just came out is not a Gothic, it's a slasher, but it is still very interesting. And he's a white dude who wrote his lead character as a Black woman in the Autumn Springs Retirement Home Massacre. And somebody at an event, I think probably well-meaning, but they were like, what was your intent behind writing this as a Black woman? Were you trying to make a statement? And he was like, no, it's just, that's how she popped in my head. And I'm like, that is in its own way the statement. That's like the end goal. That's what we want to be able to get to, is like, we can exist, like you said, Jeff, apart from like needing it, and like Mo said, apart from needing to focus on specific repression as like a way of making a statement about it, so much as I just want to be able to allow my character to feel this hysteria and feel all the things that other characters have been allowed to feel. And it's not a deliberate attempt consciously so much in a thing that I've set out determined to do, so much as that just, this is the way the story formed and it's what I wanted to tell. And I'm sorry, guys, I've got to step away, but I've loved this conversation. I'm going to go back and listen, and I can't wait to hear what Mo has to say on this. That's going to just, when I step away, Mo, just tell me, like, I want to not hear it, but I want to come back later and have like Mo be like, Johnny didn't know what the fuck.
Johnny was full of shit.
Yeah, fucking idiot. Like, what the
I
fuck
would
was he?
never.
Thank God he's off the call now.
Yeah, we've all been waiting.
Johnny, can you tell us where people can find you online before you skip?
Sure. JohnnyCompton.com. My socials are all Compton Rights. JohnnyCompton.com. You can find all my stuff. That's the simplest way to do it. Jeff, Clay, Mo, Scotty, Josh. This is a fantastic conversation. I can't wait to see you, all of you guys again. Carry on the great conversation.
Bye, Johnny. Have a good
Great
one.
talking to you.
Take care, guys.
All right, Mo, do you think that you can decenter men and still tell Gothic stories about women? And in doing so, is it you're just leaning into these other elements of the tradition, like architecture, mirroring, doubling, identity, all these other things?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, to echo Johnny's point, is that we just want to write stories. And I'm going to take the helm of also a woman of color and a woman in this and try to answer both prongs, is that I would like us to get to a point, and I think this was where Johnny was headed, is to where what we do is mundane.
Mm-hmm.
The reasons why we're doing it is a mundane reason. Just enjoy the story for what the story is. We're not trying to, and horror is political. We've already discussed that. And it's, we all have that. We've got the tapestry, we've got the t-shirt. We understand that. But sometimes it is just, we write what we know. We write who we are. We write who we surround ourselves with. We write what we look like. That is our lived experience, and we can't get out of that. And I remember there was a reporter several years ago that had interviewed Toni Morrison, and she had said, no white people in your stories, none. And Toni said, I don't understand your issue with it. Like, you help me understand what your issue is with a Black woman telling stories about other Black women or other Black people. Like, please help me understand what you need out of me to make you feel comfortable with my stories. And she was just like, well, I just feel like it's very unrealistic for there not to be any white people in your stories. And Toni had said, when you are so used to being the default and you get decentered, it really fucks with you. And you don't know how to reconcile that on your own. Like, you're asking me, the Black woman who wrote the story, to reconcile that for you so you feel better about not being centered. Do you see how weird that is? And then I feel like the woman kind of got it. And I think for us, if we're looking at building Gothic stories moving forward, then I think that naturally we are in our minds, politically, emotionally, mentally, spatially, the things that are naturally going on in our lives, we're going to write about that. And if no one's at the center of it, that's fine. I think it's a great question, but it's also very weird to answer, because it's asking the question of, these are your stories, and these are the puzzle pieces that make up Gothic. Can you write a story without a good handful of those? And I feel like, yeah, we all could. We absolutely all could. But I think it's, if we're asking Black and brown people, can you write a Gothic story without talking about slavery or repression, ritualized violence? Yes, please. Can we stop talking about trauma, for fuck's sake? Yes, can we do that? I hope we can. I hope we can write stories like that. As women writing Gothic stories, can we maybe not talk about patriarchal violence or patriarchal pressures or the hysterical woman trope? Yes, I hope we can. There's definitely room out there to do it. And like I said, I hope that when we are building these stories and putting them out there, and it's always difficult to put your baby out there once you've built it, to have people say, no, what's your motivation for doing that? What was that? Why is your character? And I've gotten the question of, like, it sounds like your character's white. Why is that? And it was like, that's how the character came fully formed in my head. I don't know what else to tell you. Like, can we build those stories? Yes. The question then begins to be, are there going to be people that can absorb and accept those stories at face value? Or is that going to create another question where people are going to be like, but why though? But why isn't there any trauma in here? Why is everyone believing her? Why does this brown woman have a love story alongside of this supernatural Gothic story? Why is that happening? So I feel like we're always sort of going to be in that hamster wheel of making art. Someone has an issue with what we've done. We make new art. There's a new, I just feel like it's going to be this vicious circle of things. But long story short, and I've taken it 30,000 feet again, I apologize. I think there definitely is room to make new stories that don't involve trauma as a basis or seed. And you're talking to someone who educates on women's trauma and horror cinema. That's like sort of like my crux and what I talk about. But I think that it doesn't need to be always stemming from Black and brown trauma. It doesn't always need to be stemming from a woman who no one believes or a woman who's, abused. We can move on from those stories. There are a number of possibilities. Like you could go on further with ideas. And I hope we do. I hope we absolutely get there.
I mean, this is something I think about a fair amount as a Jewish writer. And, when we think about Jewish narratives, either in horror or outside of horror, so much is centered on like the Holocaust story. And obviously this is very important subject to deal with, but as a Jewish writer, I find myself frustrated sometimes that it seems like the only Jewish characters we get are Holocaust survivors or people dealing with the Holocaust, or like Woody Allen or Ross and Monica from Friends. It's like there's these tropes that just keep popping up. And unfortunately, this is something that I think a lot of Jewish creators have been somewhat complicit in, particularly with these like the more modern, like I say, the Ross and Monica character is, one aspect of Jewish culture, Jewish humor is to be very self-deprecating. And I think this is a thing that we have seen, unfortunately, perpetuated throughout pop culture in general is the trope of like the nebbishy Jew or the neurotic Jew or whatever. And I've been trying to wrestle with how do I tell a Jewish story where I can kind of get away from some of these sort of conventional tropes, and sort of show this like deeper breadth of Jewish experience. And specifically what you're talking about, like how do we write stories that are about our culture or our place in the world without necessarily centering the trauma, have it be trauma porn. Because I feel like so much of like the Holocaust narrative has become kind of a trauma porn, and I'm frankly kind of over it. Like, not that I don't want to talk about the Holocaust anymore, but can we look at the Jewish experience in a wider, like you said, 30,000 foot lens? So it's something that I've definitely thought about in my own work, and I feel like I'm only have kind of scratched the surface of it,
Clay?
Just on that note, to both the expansion of Gothic horror to include more women-centric narratives and Jewish-centric narratives. Have either of you seen the movie Attachment?
Yes.
I thought it was excellent.
Attachment's one of my favorite movies of recent years.
Okay,
I
great.
have to see that.
It's
Definitely
On the
see
watch
it.
list immediately.
Yeah.
It's so good. I just wrote a very like gushy movie review about it, but it totally blew my mind. It's a romance horror. The first third of the movie is essentially a sapphic romance story, and then it turns into a Dybbuk story. But it's awesome. I mean, it's woman directed, woman written, and you can definitely feel the different like conflict points and tension points coming to a head from that female lens, I believe. Speaking as a complete male person, so that's totally okay if I'm full of shit. Mo, please let me know if I'm full of shit about that movie. But I thought
I
it
think
blew my
that's
mind,
great.
so.
If you ever want to expand on that for Night Tide, let me know.
Okay, excellent. Yes, that would be awesome. I think that movie is a great example of, and again, I can't speak from this perspective, so I'm speaking from an outside perspective, watching this happen and being really jacked about it. I think that there is not only space for it, but a pretty ravenous hunger, especially in the horror literature community. I mean, go to any magazine's submission guidelines and tell me how many of them don't say that they're looking for BIPOC specifically, that there is an extended BIPOC window. I mean, this is an indication that people are trying to make an active change, and it can feel like that's not happening on social media right now, and all the bullshit that's happening is certainly real and certainly impactful. But like, I think it's important to recognize art's place in that too, and art's refusal to lay down and die for this bullshit. And I do think we're kind of doing that in a lot of ways that maybe fly under the radar. But again, tell me if that's bullshit. I think movies like Attachment are a good illustration of that. I think movies like The Wind are a good illustration of that. Sinners getting all the nominations is a good recognition of that. And you know, that's even a good example of speaking to an oppression that has, I guess I'm going to say overshadowed for lack of a better term, but that's Irish oppression, which is a very real thing as well. Because when the Irish came to America in so many circumstances, they became the oppressors because that's obviously the better place to be. But that does water down to a pretty substantial degree the oppression of the Irish. And that's something even Sinners was very intentional about bringing in. You maybe don't notice it on the screen as much, but if you read that thing's screenplay, I mean, it's all over it. With the Irish vampire character, he's also a victim of oppression and also a force created out of that. It's a commentary on that switching of sides for your own benefit in a lot of ways. At least that's what
I got. No, and I got I had a chance to speak to a youth group about this film. They're young filmmakers. They want to go into college for film, and we were chatting about it. And I was talking to there was 3 of us. And I was talking to an Irish filmmaker about the film, and his grandfather remembers when there was signage in certain places, like restaurants, things like that, that had signs that said no Irish, no blacks, no dogs. And those were the things that weren't allowed in, which is heartbreaking. And I'm very, very beloved of the meeting both sides of that oppression head on. And that film is just absolutely gorgeous for me. I'm glad that you touched on it.
When I had my last interview with Johnny, we had this awesome conversation. I cut it because it was like an hour of us gushing about Sinners. I was talking about the profound sense of doom that was hovering over Sinners. Josh, you were saying that you don't think that Los Angeles can support Gothic. You think it's noir. And when I think of noir, I think of doom.
I'd love a chance to clarify, because that was kind of a generalization. But I do think a lot of what people call Los Angeles Gothic is noir. That doesn't mean that there's not space for the Gothic in Los Angeles or any other big city. And, you know, the great Gothic horror set in cities is the things that make you feel isolated, even in an abundance of a population. You know, the ones that take place in an apartment building, but it seems like no one else is ever there. If they're there, they're never going to open the door for you. You know, a lot of J horror like Dark Water and, you know, things that take place. The most recent Evil Dead Rise takes place in Los Angeles, and it still feels very like they're very isolated and alone in this experience that they're having. So I do think Los Angeles, any city, you can have urban Gothic. You mentioned Batman, and I kind of don't think Batman is Gothic because he's never, he is of the populace, you know. Gothic is a very personal experience where you are looking behind the door. You are internalizing something. It's too personal to take place in a surrounding of action, in a frenetic, populated, busy environment. You know, we talk a lot about how, you know, almost everything is Gothic, and that's true. You know, Batman almost is Gothic, but you can talk about the things that aren't Gothic about it.
Well, one thing that I think is interesting, just piggybacking on what you're saying about this distinction between noir and Gothic, because I agree with that, but I do think there's kind of a Venn diagram where they can overlap. And some of the most interesting stories are stories where I think they have elements of both. So, like, I specifically think of the movie Memento, which I think primarily is a noir, but it has some Gothic elements to it, particularly with this sense of like memory not being able to escape the past. You know, I mean, Leonard is literally living in the past because he can't form new memories. You know, so there's a Gothic tinge to that story, even though I agree that I would call that primarily an LA noir story.
Yeah, it's the difference between having Gothic elements and being a Gothic film / book / story.
Sorry, I do have to hop off soon.
Mo, before you leave us, can you give us your socials where we can find you online?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Mo Moshaty on everything. So I'm Mo Moshaty on Instagram. Moshaty on Blue Sky. I'm not on the artist formerly known as Twitter anymore. I can't do it, but you can follow Nighttide Mag is also on Instagram and Blue Sky. Nighttidemag.com is our magazine. So please do follow that. And at moshaty.com, you can see where all of my new lectures are taking place. I'll be in Aberdeen in a couple weeks talking at Granite Noir, which is going to be really, really exciting, talking about messy women. So I'm really, really psyched about that. So yeah. Again, thank you so much for having me. This was absolutely excellent, and I can't wait to listen back.
All right. Thanks, Mo. Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Josh, what are some of your favorite examples of Gothic?
Well, I'm just going to talk about my favorite examples in the moment. The authors I mentioned before, Allison Mick, who just released Humboldt Cut that came out, I think the last Tuesday in January. She's African-American, and, I really hope Mo's read it, because I think that it embodies a lot of the new Gothic elements that Mo was speaking of. And the author of Moonflow, Bitter Corella, they actually identify as a gender fluid goblin. So you can use whatever pronouns you like. And they bring a trans element into Gothic, which is very apropos when you talk about, the possession and identity and, expectations and things like that. So, yeah, I'm really lucky to have hooked up with these two very talented authors, and I'm looking forward to doing some panels, maybe putting together a little tour with them, because they are new Gothic. Mo should have them definitely on her podcast, because I think the three of them could just riff forever, and it'd be some really telling and wonderful conversations. But yeah, I'm going to give it up to my contemporaries, who both released something very Gothic and very geographically centered in the Pacific Northwest and the Redwood Coast.
Nice.
Clay?
I have so many examples. I'll spare you from reading them all and just tell you I have them in a few different categories. So, like, if you're looking for classic Gothic, I can't quit The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. I mean, that's just one of my favorite, classic horror stories of all time. And Dorian Gray is probably one of my favorite classic. Also, Rebecca is just a fantastic book with a pretty decent movie adaptation. That doesn't really have as many, it's still pretty speculative, The Ghost of the Other Wife and all that. So I recommend those three for classics. For contemporaries, I'm going to say them all because these are our contemporaries and you should read all of these people. House of Leaves is just my favorite book of all time, but I think that's a very Gothic story. Pour One for the Devil by Theodore Van Alst from Lanternfish Press. That's a novella, but very, very good from an indigenous perspective with a really unique cultural backdrop to it. Very specific about basically a dead language that only lives on this one island in the South. And the main character happens to be a scholar on it. Definitely check it out. It's good. And it's a novella, so you can read it in a day. Mapping the Interior by Stephen Graham Jones, I think, is a really cool Gothic-y haunted house story that's very ethereal and very literary, but classic Stephen Graham Jones stuff, breaking down a bunch of indigenous cultural stuff through a very close perspective on the protagonist. I thought Jennifer Thorne's Diavola was really good. Nice, kind of a classic Gothic tale. Takes place in Italy and comes home with her to the States. So very good. Everything by Junji Ito. But I really like Liminal Zone, one of his more recent collections. There's one in there called The Weeping Woman that was one of the spookiest stories I've read in a graphic novel form for a long time. Definitely recommend Liminal Zone. Amakatsu's The Deep takes place on the Titanic. That's a nice Gothic tale right there on the Titanic. At least I felt like it was pretty Gothic. I think Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark is pretty Gothic, especially since all the real horror is coming from that basement of the house, that repressed life of that little girl. And then last one I'll say is Ling Hoon by Ai Zhang. That's a really, really unique haunted house story. Very Gothic. Completely rooted in grief and decay and not being able to let go of that grief. So I definitely think those are some of my favorite contemporaries. And then lots of good films. Nosferatu by Eggers. I don't care what you say, Jeff. That's a fucking masterpiece. And it's way better than Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula.
I said Nosferatu was fine.
Yeah, I say it's a fucking masterpiece, and I don't care what you say. Attachment, really, really, really good. Definitely watch Attachment. Obviously, Haunting of Hill House, that's one of the best horror TV shows ever created, and I will die on that hill. And there's many, many more. You can look them up. I'll give my full list to Jeff for the show notes, but the last couple I'll throw in that I think are a little more in line with what I was talking about with P&W Gothic, where it's that active resistance. of the things that would oppress you is the wind. I've mentioned a few times. I do think Eggers the Witch is a similar idea. The Wasteland by David Casa de Munt. That's a really, really good movie, kind of similar to The Witch and The Wind. It's very much isolation horror, but it's got a lot of Gothic elements. And then His House by Remy Weeks, which is about a couple of South Sudanese refugees who are forced to live in this like tenement building in London. And it's a perfect example of what I was talking about with the Gilded Cage, where it's like, hey, you should be thanking us for this. But what really happens is they get put in the ghetto, and the people who own that tenement know damn well it's haunted. And one of the rules to live there is you don't get to move out, you don't get to leave. And it's just a classic like narrative around all that kind of bullshit. So I definitely recommend it.
Excellent list. Scotty?
Well, I'm really glad that Attachment came up because that is, I think, it's very Gothic, and I think it's one of the best sort of slow burn creep fest horror movies of the last few years. I actually think Nia DaCosta's new version of Candyman is really pretty great, and it's also got building on the Gothic elements of the original, I think, is but putting in this new kind of gentrifying world of what Chicago is, at least at the time that movie was made. In terms of book, one book that is one of my all-time favorites, and if people are interested in a deeper discussion on it, me and Tamika Thompson did a deep dive into it on my podcast, Horror from the High Desert. But Tananarive Dew's The Between, it's about 30 years old at this point, but that is, I think, just taking the classic elements of the Gothic and putting it in this very contemporary, very Black experience kind of lens. Talk about decentering white people. Tananarive Dew was doing that, like I said, 30 years ago. More recently, I think Sylvia Moreno Garcia's Mexican Gothic is just a fucking classic. I also think Violet by Scott Thomas that's a really kind of classic Gothic ghost story. But again, I think that's from 2020, so it's also very contemporary lens. And then the last one I'll mention is Emma Molivis's Sundown is San Ojuela. Josh, what we were talking about with Bitter Corral, like Emma Molivis, she's a trans woman, she's Mexican American, she's writing through that lens. It's not a trans story, but I think that perspective just is so present in the voice of that book, and the Gothic elements of that, it deals with some mythologies that we don't encounter in sort of the classic sort of Anglophilic Gothic that we're used to, because it's very Mexican, it's very indigenous. So that's a book I really, Emma Molivis is just a fantastic writer, and I really strongly recommend that book.
Awesome.
Shout out Lanternfish Press. That's another one from Lanternfish on this list.
Yeah, definitely.
So
awesome.
I'm gonna button it up. I'm gonna bring this panel to a close. Josh, can you tell people where to find you online?
Yeah, just hit me up on Instagram, Joshua_Millican. It was great to be here. It was fabulous to meet you guys. Everyone who participated in the panel gets a copy of Dopefoot. You get a copy of Dopefoot. You get a copy of Dopefoot. You get a copy of Dopefoot. And I can't wait to hear what you guys think about it.
Oh, yeah, man. I'll trade you for a crevasse.
Clay, where can people find you online? Where can't they find you online? Jesus.
I'm online way too much. It's a problem. I have those other places, but I really hang out on Instagram for social media. And the place where it's best to hang out with me, because you can do it live, is once a week on my podcast, Fermented Fiction. Please go to our Fermented Fiction YouTube, like and subscribe there, and then join us live, because we have conversations like this every week with authors from all around the literary realm and filmmakers. That's probably what I'm most embroiled in most of the time. So I would say Fermented Fiction on YouTube is a great place. We have a Substack too, or on Instagram, I'm at Vermulm Fiction. We got Rain Shadow Stories. That's where we created this book. So this book was created by a podcast. We give each other prompts, we write stories, and at the end of the month, we critique those stories live on the air, and eventually they all get put into a book. We're working on volume 2 right now. So volume 2 as a book will be out next year. All this year we'll be giving the prompts, writing the stories, and critiquing them on the show. So that's Beneath the Rain Shadow. You can find that on the Fermented Fiction YouTube as well. They're all under the Fermented Fiction umbrella. And we have me, Tamara K. Selman, Gordon B. White has joined us for this season of Beneath the Rain Shadow, which is really exciting. And M. Lee, another author from the PNW. Come check us out over there. That'd be great.
So every flavor of Pacific Northwest Gothic you could ever want is being served up fresh. I would say almost served up raw over there, and they're chopping it up. Scotty, where can people find you online?
Website is scottymilder.com. You can find links to like pretty much all of my fiction that I've published, my movies, Dead Billy, and my podcasts. I have 2 podcasts, but for the horror fans, the one I would direct you to is Horror from the High Desert. You can find that pretty much anywhere where you stream your podcast. And then for social media, like everyone else, I'm mostly on Instagram. So it's either Scotty Milder Horror or the Horror from the High Desert podcast Instagram accounts. That's primarily where you're going to find me. And then my other podcast, just quick mention, I do have another podcast with my friend Amelia. It's called The Weirdest Thing. It's sort of a mixture between like My Favorite Murder meets stuff we missed in history class meets a pop culture, just general purpose discussion. So it's not really horror focused, but sometimes we get into horror type subjects and definitely weird history and things like that. So yeah, check that one out as well.
Thank you for participating in the panel. Thank you for stretching the bounds of what the Gothic can be and helping me understand a little better on what the Gothic is. So I will sign off and say, stay Gothic. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe and follow. We're now on YouTube. Links are in the show notes. You can find me at jeffccarter.com and pick up my collection, We Bleed Orange and Black, 31 fun-sized tales for Halloween. Until next time, stay spooktacular.